Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Monday night. We're going to dive into the topic of fraud like we so often have for several years and now here at KARE 11. Joining me, Kelly Dietz from the I-Team. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Jana.
Hello.
Always happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us often. And today, we want to talk about something that's happening at the state capitol, and that is Senator John Hoffman has a committee hearing today about a bill that officially terminates HSS, Housing Stabilization Services. This all started with some of your investigations. So before we go back in time, what does it mean to officially terminate HSS?
So today, what's being discussed is officially striking that language in state code that the HSS program is in effect. It is a terminated program. They need to take it out and do what they've said that they've been wanting to do since terminating the program, and that is to completely rewrite it. In order to completely rewrite it, it has to be done away with. So that's taking that first step to wipe it clean so that the program can be completely rewritten in a way that has more efficacy and has more state guardrails.
So is the plan to bring something like it back that just has more guardrails?
I would say the plan is to bring something like it that gives fraud less of a path forward. Mm-hmm. So maybe not something like it because the system that we had previously gave way to lots and lots of fraud, but it is to try and bring a like system that actually works for the taxpayer and works for vulnerable Minnesotans.
And so let's talk a little bit about its intention at the get-go and if that is something that is needed, because I know you talked to a lot of people that actually used the program legally and it was beneficial to Minnesotans, lots of Minnesotans. So the program is intended to help who and why?
So the program is intended to help vulnerable Minnesotans with disabilities, the elderly, find and maintain housing. So a point of important clarification is this is not a program that actually keeps people in homes. Mm-hmm. It's a program that helps them find and maintain that housing. So think of things like, I am looking for an apartment. You are my HSS provider. You help me find open apartment listings close to my place of work. Okay. I then find an apartment, but I need to maintain cleanliness. You help me set up my electric records. You provide me with household cleaning supplies. Those sorts of things to just help in the process for people who really need those services.
And in any part in your investigation, did you come into contact with Minnesotans or providers that were doing this on the up and up where you saw that it did have benefit?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. Not only did we talk with providers themselves, but we also talked with Minnesotans who had been helped and had been, finding a first stable place to land for the first time in their lives. So this certainly has legs to create some really meaningful change and some pretty important services for some folks. But unfortunately, in the words of Joe Thompson, former U.S. prosecutor, there was likely more fraud than good in many of these service programs and especially in HSS.
Hence the reason to purge the records from HSS in every shape and form and start over.
Yeah.
How long does that really take?
That's unclear. I mean, it's legislature. It's, all these things need to jump through multiple hoops. But I think that the first batch, based on what was talked about today in the committee hearing, is that the DHS, who's the state oversight agency, the Department of Human Services, they had some language that said that they will essentially create a relationship with the legislature and then move forward and make some recommendations as to how the program should be rewritten by 2027. So we're in really early stages.
And because this program was shut down last year, right, by the governor?
So in August 2025, the program was announced that it would be terminated. It was then actually terminated in November of 2025.
Okay.
So
we've been without it now for better part of 3 months, 3.5 months. And that means that service just isn't available for the Minnesotans who need it.
Yeah. And that service is one of 14 others that were also designated by the state as high-risk Medicaid services. So they all take Medicaid dollars, and then they were put under this umbrella of fraud could be happening here. Many service programs of which our I-Team has also found many stories of individuals who say that they were not served and were billed for services not provided.
Right, and this is really kind of a primer of how local journalism can work. You all started doing the work on this fraud, it wasn't just feeding our future. You started looking into HSS and you saw all of this fraud happening. It kind of takes on a life of its own in terms of the partisan politics in Minnesota. But then it reaches a whole new level in December of last year. And it is then the impetus for Operation Metro Surge. It is the reason the governor and the attorney general are being called to Washington on Wednesday to testify before Congress. I don't know if you've had any chance to reflect on the work that started locally and then what it became on, lessons learned for you.
Yeah, I reflect a lot. But I think that if I had to think of all that's happened, I can only take credit for my work and our team's work and the things that we have researched and really, really heavily vetted. Mm-hmm. And that is that there was fraud happening in these services. Mm. All of the politics and the fallout and all that is unfortunately or fortunately going to be what it is. Mm-hmm. And on one hand, to see the impact of journalism just in terms of okay, does fraud exist and what's the impact of what our investigations have found? That's just mind-blowing sometimes. But it's also the purpose of journalism is to show people what's going on. And I think that on a grand scale, there's only so much of that we can or want to take credit for.
And we can't control how politicians are going to take the work that was done, the actual investigative work, and try to turn it into their own thing. And that's for a whole different show, probably cable news, to be fought over with pundits. But what I think about when I think back on all the work that you all did and the conversations that we had, I think a lot about the people that were supposed to be getting services, because you all talk to people, individual people with names, with families, with friends in Minnesota, and they saw in black and white what you saw or they showed you. They're saying I did this and they billed me this and none of this ever happened.
Yeah, and I will say that's really the only thing that matters is these individuals. A lot of people who we did speak to that were in this space that qualified for these services were not only disabled Minnesotans, but they were individuals in recovery, and that qualified them for these Medicaid services. And one thing that really stood out to me was how taken advantage of they felt, that this fraud was being committed on the backs of people who make this pledge to sobriety, to loyalty, to trust, and to honesty. And in the face of asking for services that are supposed to address that promise, their names are being used to put on a piece of paper and bill for an untrustworthy cause for fraud.
And I don't think that people really recognize the courage it takes and the amount of vulnerability that is present when a person comes to an investigative team and they say, if it were me, I, Jana, have these bills, I will trust you to look at them. And fraud was committed in my name when I was trying to become a better Minnesotan. Mm-hmm. That stings.
Yeah. Yeah, it stings, and it's not something that sits with anyone well. But I will say, one individual who came to us very early on, Rachel Lean, her story was able to be brought to the state capitol. She was able to finally have her voice and for it to be taken seriously and heard. Some of these other individuals that we've spoken to have been screaming to the rooftops, screaming to state agencies, and for someone to take a look at this for as long as we've seen fraud in some of these programs. And it does weigh heavily on my heart when we have the opportunity to give a voice to someone who has been really wanting that and deserving of that for so long.
Right. I mean, the people that you all worked with weren't some YouTuber that just went and made a video that a bunch of people saw. These were people that didn't have a voice. And I think that we should just work really hard to center them. As politicians from either side try to center the political point they're trying to make, we don't want to forget the people that were trying to use these services legally and use them to help themselves be a better neighbor. And now they're out. get those services right now because the whole thing has to be redone because it was so vulnerable to fraud.
Yeah, and like to your point earlier, it's going to take a considerable amount of time to bring the entire program back to a place of solid, like being solid and working for vulnerable Minnesotans.
And not to mention the trust aspect.
Yeah.
You know, there's going to be, again, like even if it's tried to be brought back by whatever new name that comes.
Yeah, you might actually lose a portion of that vulnerable population from wanting to sign up for these services again in fear of, well, it didn't work for me last time.
Right.
Like last time I actually was barred from getting housing because I was working with this provider who told me that they were waiting on these applications, waiting on these services, but they actually just were never working for me, and instead I spent all of these months living in the cold and living in tents when I could have just actually been getting myself a way to get housing.
And that is the stuff that kind of you think about on your drive home as a journalist.
Yeah.
Like you have to do the thing without fear or favor to show that taxpayers are being defrauded in Minnesota. But there are going to be people who are hurt by it.
Yeah, and the only light at the end of that tunnel is that this program can come back stronger and it will have better guardrails, and then in the future this is all for a purpose, and it needed to happen because surely vulnerable people cannot be taken advantage of, and taxpayers cannot continue to have their dollars stolen from them.
And lastly, again, because I want to center those folks that did everything right and needed the services and were courageous enough to ask for the services, and then they were taken advantage of. Do you feel from those that you talk to that they have a sense of satisfaction that at least they got the agency to have their story told?
Yeah. Yeah, we are in contact with most, if not all, and in terms of the stories and the way that they've been able to create that change, it's been, I think, pretty gratifying.
That they were able to say, I'm going to stand up.
Yeah, and I have a voice, and here is my story, and believe me, not just because I'm saying it, but here's Medicaid billing to show for it, and where I was when they billed, and I wasn't actually where they say I was, or they weren't doing the same thing that they say I was, or they were, and here is it laid out, and here it is to you because we trust you, and we think that your journalism can change something. Like that's big.
And that's the other thing that we should say as journalists, like without your stories, we don't have anything. Like we don't have the proof. If the people don't take the courage to trust us to tell the story in the first place, it doesn't get told. And so it's a two-way street.
Yeah. I think on some levels we've done a lot of these stories, but that's just not stopping us from, like, if you have a story, we still want to know, even if it's in a program we've covered, even if it's something we've already done, we're on the beat of. It really doesn't matter. The story is the story, and we are trying to get to the bottom of it as much as we can.
Well, as we go through these painful parts of this process, they are necessary parts of the process. Kelly Dietz, we thank you for all the work you've done on this and other stories, and we thank you for being on Breaking the News Plus tonight.
Thank you.
That's all for us on this Monday night. We'll see you next time. Take care.